Hello and welcome to Lakehead's online language and literacy conference. I would like to introduce myself along with my colleagues Allison, Elizabeth, Ali, and Duncan. Today we will be looking at diverse storytelling in the Canadian classroom, a resource. I would first like to address our positionality. So before we dive deeper into our presentation, we would like to acknowledge that as contributors to this presentation, we do not identify as members of a visible minority group. Throughout our presentation, we will discuss diversity, and we would like to note that our own positionality will undoubtedly have an influence on this presentation. So throughout this presentation, we're first going to look at what is the problem. We're going to look at the three major issues that are posed within the context of diverse voices in the classroom. We will then move to the statistics and look at how diverse our current bookshelves and classrooms are and what areas need improvement. From there, we'll move on to the implications and how it affects the students' learning and achievement goals. We will then look at our solution and how we created this diverse classroom library to use as a resource. And then we will dive deeper into the resource by actually looking into the website and seeing what we have available.
So for the terms of our presentation, we just wanted to define what a minoritized group is. So for the sake of this presentation, when we use the term minoritized group, we are referring to those who identify themselves as a minoritized group based on race, ethnicity, gender identity, gender expression, disability, and/or socioeconomic status. What we are not attempting to say is that people within these groups have experienced the same level or type of discrimination, or that these things do not act intersectionally. So we will first dive into the problem that we first saw. So when looking at either our cohort or at school or within the classroom explicitly, it's overwhelmingly white, including this presentation. We are all white. So there's little representation for those who are a minoritized group. So we wanted to create something that helps bridge the gap between white educators and including diverse voices in the classroom without having to lean heavily on guest speakers or over-the-top presentations. So diversity is something that should be presented throughout all aspects of our teaching practice, not just in small moments. So first we set out to see whether or not the problem was obvious for the rest of Ontario. This leads us to the research question that we developed. So how can white educators include diverse voices in meaningful ways? So we determined that including these voices means including authentic voices, so including them through stories or through books. Through our literature search, we found three major problems within representation of diversity in the classroom. So first being discrimination in the classroom. So everyone comes to the classroom with their own lived experiences and their own implicit biases, and we must overcome these in order to be a fair and just educator. Second, being the lack of minority representation in the classroom. Many educators are white, therefore, generally speaking, there's not a role model or shared experience between the teacher and the student. Third is the lack of representation in books and in authors that we share in our classroom. So many students can't connect to the books or the literature we use in the classroom because they can't see themselves or identify with the characters in the book. So Duncan will now share the numbers and the statistics we found to back these problems up.
Through our research, we identified 4 areas where diversity is severely lacking in literature. On our bookshelves, 77 to 89% of people in the publishing industry are white, and it shows a severe lack of racial diversity in our books that we put on our classroom bookshelves. In internationally educated teaching, an internationally educated teacher is 6 times more likely to be unemployed in their first year searching for a teaching job, and the ones that do find a job usually find it in a temporary space or as a substitute teacher. In locally educated teaching, there's up to a 28.6% difference of visible minority teachers to the population in some areas of Canada, and that shows a really big gap in the number of visible minority and the teacher representation of those groups. In teacher education programs, students of African and Indigenous heritage are vastly underrepresented in higher education, especially in education programs, and they are also found to be more likely to drop out. The stats from this slide are based on the Crisp et al. And the Pollock and Antonelli studies that will be linked later in our presentation. Visible minority teachers face more obstacles than most teaching in Canada. Only 5.4% of teachers are visible minorities in Canada, and the population of visible minorities is 13.4%. This makes for a 7.6 difference in visible minority teachers versus the overall population across Canada. There are also only 4% visible minority teachers in the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. These numbers show that there is a clear racial gap in teaching, and we are not hiring enough minority teachers to fill teaching roles in Canada. These stats are from the Pollock and Antonelli article. This graph shows further lack of diversity in our book publishers and reviewers. You can see here that 96% of book publishers and reviewers are non-disabled and 91% are heterosexual. Only 1% are intersex, trans, or non-conforming. With so little diversity in the review and publishing space, how can enough diverse books be created for our students? It's a problem that has to be addressed at the root and must be fixed in this publishing and review industry. These stats are from the Crisp et al. Study. This graph shows stats from the Crisp et al. Study of 1,169 books at 11 ECE sites. As you can see on the graph, over 90% of books were English language only, showing a clear lack of bilingualism or language diversity in these books. 71.4% of libraries had a problematic book, which is very concerning because these libraries have not removed those books, and more audits should be done on what is contained in these school libraries to remove books like that. 53.5% of leading characters were male and 28.2% were female, showing a clear difference in gender diversity in books. There were also only 2.7% of books that had a character with an exceptionality, and 11% of books that featured a visible minority. Even less of these visible minority books depicted a non-white culture. This shows that characters with exceptionalities or characters of minority races are shown a lot less often in our bookshelves than they should be. There were also no books with an openly LGBTQ+ character, which is particularly worrying. Only one book mentioned LGBTQ+, and it was for one page out of 1,169 books. These stats are all from the Crisp et al. Study.
The individual teacher may feel powerless when looking at this information. Much of the research we have discussed has large system-wide implications. Fixing the root of these issues may not directly fall upon our individual shoulders, but that does not mean we are powerless. Educators have a duty to their students to improve issues of diversity wherever possible. There is still a significant amount of opportunity to be a change agent and provide opportunities in your classroom for all students to feel respected, valued, and represented. These are the three main implications for the classroom that we'll be focusing on. The first is student achievement. As seen in the research, there is a link between representation and student achievement. When students can see themselves in their teacher, they may feel safer to take risks, feel that their teacher truly believes in them, and feel like they are understood and that they're represented in this classroom. But representation does not simply have to mean directly relating to your teacher. A teacher does not have to be the physical symbol of representation in order to have positive change in the classroom. A teacher can foster a classroom where all students feel represented in a variety of ways. And finally, belonging. All students deserve a classroom that is a safe space where their voice is heard. Students should feel safe to test their limits, take risks, and grow from what they have learned. It is our duty as educators to do whatever we can to foster a classroom where all students belong and feel like the classroom belongs to them. So how can we achieve these goals? Here are 3 actions we propose taking in the classroom in order to foster student belonging and representation. The first action is making social justice pedagogy a focus of your classroom. Social justice issues must be explicitly discussed in the classroom. If you ignore an uncomfortable issue, it does not simply go away. The next step is fostering critical literacy pedagogy. Students must develop these skills to critically evaluate text and recognize both what is and what is not being said. Without prioritizing critical thought, we run the risk of students believing in and perpetuating harmful biases. Teaching our students these necessary critical thinking skills will help them to recognize and overcome their own biases and be better prepared to engage in meaningful experiences with a critical lens, both inside and outside the classroom. Finally, we propose collecting a variety of diverse books for your classroom. We believe it is pivotal for teachers to have books that provide various perspectives and representation for all. We suggest using books from diverse authors, books that share diverse stories, and books that feature diverse characters. It's not simply enough to have these books on the shelf, but you also need to ensure that these books are being used throughout your classroom instruction.
As Liz mentioned, it is important for students to see themselves represented in the classroom so that they may feel valued in their learning environment. In order to assist educators in bringing diverse voices into the classroom, we have created a website database with diverse picture books. For each book, the titles, author, and an image are included, along with a short summary of the story and the recommended age for the topics covered in the book. Within the database created, there are 10 areas of representation with 100 picture books total. The areas of representation include gender identity, Asian and South Asian representation, disability representation, Black representation, Middle Eastern representation, diverse holiday celebrations, Indigenous representation, female representation, classism, and Latinx representation. Within this database of books, we acknowledge the financial implication that can come with adding resources to a classroom. It is beneficial to keep in mind that purchasing physical copies of books is not the only option when improving a classroom library. Many books can be purchased digitally or possibly accessed through apps. Rotating in stories from the school library, public libraries, or sharing with other educators in the school can be a great way to access diverse voices and share them with your students. We also suggest speaking with school librarians to inquire if recommendations can be made when new books are being purchased. Seeing such a large array of books on our website can be overwhelming. It is important to recognize that every diverse voice added to the classroom library is a step closer to students seeing themselves represented in their learning environment. Here we have suggested 3 ways to use our resource. Our website can be used to help find diverse stories to use in lesson plans and classroom activities such as read-alouds. It can be used to help educators evaluate and update their own classroom library. And finally, it can be utilized by school administrators and library staff to analyze the diversity of library books and other text resources available to students and educators in the school. Creating a diverse classroom library is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. Educators must continue to reevaluate their resources as shifts in understanding occur over time. I will now pass it over to Erin, who will walk us through our website.
Okay, so now we're going to move forward into diving deeper into our website and looking at how to navigate this. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to share the website with you. So this is our homepage, Diverse Storytelling in the Canadian Classroom, a resource. And if you scroll down, you will see our different categories there, different forms of representation. It also has a tab on the left-hand side here, which makes it really easy to navigate. So say I want to bring in Indigenous representation into my classroom, I can hit that tab and it'll take me to the page of different books that we have provided that we think would be a great resource for your classroom. And a lot of them will have the grade recommendation or the age recommendation of when to use this book. It also, every book will have its title, who the author is, and a little summary on what the book is about, so that you can have a general understanding of, will this fit into what I want to provide my class? If I want to go look at something like disability representation, we can take a look here. We can see that read alouds are also linked to some of our books. So if you want to, instead of purchasing the book, or if, your classroom budget, things are not always equitable in different places, read aloud is also provided if you want to show your book that way, which I think is really great and makes it very equitable for all schools to access this library. We have Latinx here with more grade recommendations. So really this website, we've designed it so that it's really easy to use, user-friendly for teachers. So it's really simple to be able to incorporate these stories into your classroom in these books that are also written by authors that match their representation, which I think is also really important. So that's our website, very simple and easy to use, and can be an awesome and amazing resource in the classrooms. And I think it'll be very beneficial for not only teachers, but by introducing these different representations to your class as well. And the students will do really great things. So
we just want to end off our presentation by this quote from Kazuo Ishiguro. But in the end, stories are about one person saying to another, "This is what it feels like to me. Can you understand? Does it also feel this way to you?" This quote was mentioned during the panel discussion, and it really resonated with our intent of our research and the resource that we created. So we felt like we should connect it back to that panel discussion.